Hi, this is Kowski, and in this video we're going to be looking at each of the foundational documents required for the AP Gov exam. Now keep in mind that this is just a cursory overview and that there are more in-depth videos on my website on each of these foundational documents, but here is a quick overview. So in Federalist number 10, we're looking at Madison discussing the role of factions. And it's important to note that the context of all these Federalist Papers that we're going to be going over is that this is after the American Revolutionary War. This is after we've just scrapped the Articles of Confederation and we've created this new Constitution, and now we need the states to ratify this. So the Federalist Papers are really advocating for ratification. Now for Madison, he sees factions or the rise of groups as inevitable. Certainly he wants to remove the causes or just simply control its impact. And since he sees that removing the causes of factions would infringe upon people's liberty to form them in the first place, he sees it better to try to control their impact. And he says in a small democracy, it cannot stop the rise of factions as they are part of the nature of man. So he's going to advocate that, listen, like, we cannot work in a small democracy with, 13 individual states that are more like, friends more than a country. So he's going to advocate for a large republic in which factions are going to counterbalance one another. The idea being, in a very large republic, you're going to have so many more people and you're going to have way more factions, so that the disastrous effects of these factions are going to be greatly diminished due to the number of people. And again, he's going to have this idea that no one particular faction is going to dominate. And this is very reminiscent of this concept known as pluralism, which you should be familiar with in Unit 1, as it refers to one interest group not dominating over another interest group. It's basically a level playing field. Now, in Federalist Paper number 51, Madison is also going to be writing this particular paper, and he's going to be addressing the role of checks and balances, and he espouses this idea of separation of powers. And one of the more famous quotes that comes out of this paper is that ambition must be made to counteract ambition, and this is where you're going to be getting this separation of powers and checks and balances. And he's going to be arguing that with this checks and balances, that you're going to be able to prevent one branch from encroaching upon the other branch and making sure that each branch is doing what it's supposed to be doing. He also is going to argue that these functions of each branch need to be independent in order to perform their functions. And again, another very famous quote that comes out of Federalist 51 is that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. So he's trying to really assuage people's fears that the federal government is going to get too big, that one branch is going to dominate over the other, and he says we're going to have a system in place that prevents this from happening. So Madison is going to be very vocal in these papers in terms of trying to make people feel more comfortable with having a federal government with three branches. Now let's go to Federalist Paper number 70. In this case, this is going to be argued by Hamilton, who's going to be arguing for a single and strong executive leader. And this is very different from the Articles of Confederation, where you don't even have a national executive at all. And keep in mind, they were looking at possibly having a national council made up of various people. But Hamilton's going to say, you know what, if you have one person, it's going to add more accountability as opposed to having a council. If you have multiple people acting in the executive branch, they could simply point fingers and say, no, he did this, or this person's responsible for this. With one person, you can make them more accountable, you can cast the blame on them, because it's just one person who's going to be held accountable for the actions in the executive branch. And Hamilton's also going to be talking about this idea of energy in the executive, that you can sort of act a little bit faster, unlike the legislative branch was a little bit slower, and that you can also prevent as well as defend against legislative encroachments on presidential power. And then lastly, Hamilton's going to advocate that this allows purpose, direction, and flexibility in the branch. Keep in mind, again, as the legislative branch is one of the smaller branches, or not necessarily smaller branches, but slower branches. And I mean, think about how long it takes for a bill to become a law, if it's even lucky enough to get through all those hurdles. With a president, you can have, especially during emergencies and wars, the presidency can act a lot faster, especially with energy. So again, Hamilton's going to say we don't need to fear this president. Again, keep in mind with 51, we already have checks and balances, but also the idea that the president is going to bring energy, there's going to be accountability, and this is not going to be morphing into a tyrant. Now, the final Federalist Paper that you need to know is Federalist number 78. This one, of course, written by Hamilton, and this is going to be addressing the judicial branch. Remember, there's a little bit of a fear about the role of having a federal court system. But Hamilton's going to say this is going to be the weakest of the three branches because it does not have the power of the purse nor the sword. So when the Supreme Court makes rulings, it doesn't go out there and enforce them. So when you see Ruth Bader Ginsburg making a ruling, do you see her going out with a sword to wherever she, the case that she's making and ruling upon? Is she going out to make sure that people are following it? No, right? That is dependent upon the executive branch. So in many ways, the judicial branch is the least dangerous because it does not affect, implementation in terms of, let's say, the sword metaphorically, or the purse, how money is going to be spent. And Hamilton's also going to be advocating for tenure for life because once these people are in the court, they will not be as influenced, hopefully, ideally speaking, by the person who appointed them because they cannot be removed for any reason with the exception of treason. And of course, they're not going to be beholden to the person who they appointed to or one particular political party. And that's the sort of idea to make them sort of very apolitical. And this is the essay that's cited, interestingly enough, most by the justices. Now, Brutus number 1 is going to be the counterpart to the Federalist Papers. This is written by anti-federalists that's going to be arguing against the ratification of this new constitution. They really dislike the amount of power given to the federal government. And that's not really anything to be surprised about, right? You just gave the states all this power in the Articles of Confederation. Now you're taking this away. And Brutus 1 is going to be arguing that a small republic is needed. And they don't like the idea of having many factions in a large republic, as it's the thought process nothing will get done, and you'll basically have a policy gridlock. So Brutus 1 does not take a very favorable approach to pluralism like we see in Federalist 10. They also see the Elasta Clause, also known as the Necessary and Proper Clause, along with the Supremacy Clause as huge threats to state power because basically you could justify anything. And they're sort of right. I mean, even when you look at the Commerce Clause, for example, if you know the history behind that, that's upheld so many different pieces of legislation, really don't have that much to do with commerce, and they have been major boons to the power of the national government. Brutus 1 is sort of correct in that respect. And he's also going to be fearful that the judiciary will infringe upon the legislative powers in the states. So for all of these reasons here, amongst other ones, he is going to be very, very much against the ratification because he sees this as an erosion of state power and is going to simply like the idea of a small republic as opposed to a larger republic. And then the Declaration of Independence, you're probably already familiar with, but think of this as a breakup letter written by Thomas Jefferson. And this is going to establish many of our big concepts here in AP Gov, including self-government, life, liberty, and of course, popular sovereignty, the idea that people should be able to control and make the decisions for their country. What the majority wants, give them. So in the opening, he's sort of laying the bedrock idea about when a government becomes tyrannical and abuses its rights, that ideally the people have the right to overthrow the government. And this is going to draw heavily upon the Enlightenment, especially Locke amongst Montesquieu and several other Enlightenment thinkers. And then the second part is where he's going to list various reasons for separating from Great Britain. And many of these are actually directed towards King George. What's interesting is that King George's name is actually never mentioned explicitly, but it is, of course, implicitly implied. And then the final part here is where they're going to try to end, at least on paper, the colonial relationship with Britain, basically breaking up. And this is going to lead to the American Revolutionary War. So this is going to be a major document, certainly a foundational document for Americans to look at. And while this is just a breakup letter on paper, and this leads to the war. Again, it's very important to keep in mind that there are many other events that led to the Revolutionary War, but this was sort of the symbolic gesture, if you will, that creates the immediate catalyst to war. And then, of course, after the American Revolutionary War, we have the Articles of Confederation, which arguably is America's first constitution, where we see the bulk of power going to the states. Remember, the national government does not have much power at all. You have no executive, you have no national court system, they could not raise a military. Each state is coining its own currency. It's a complete mess. And really, it's more of a league of friendship amongst the states than a country. And what is going to expose these weaknesses, of course, is Shays' Rebellion, which is going to erupt, and the national government can't do a darn thing about that. So this is going to sort of strike the fear within the Founding Fathers to say, you know what, this Article of Confederation looks great on paper, but practically speaking, it is not going to work well. And that's where they're going to try to scrap this, and you're going to have the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where they're going to make, you guessed it, the new U.S. Constitution. Now, for me to really cover the U.S. Constitution in all of its depth in the next couple minutes is just completely impossible, but keep in mind it is very methodically organized. It contains enumerated rights, which are spelled out. They have concurrent rights, which are between the national and the state government, which they share the similar powers, such as taxation. And then, of course, you have your reserve powers, which are going to be going to the states. But Article 1 is going to list the powers of Congress. You're going to have the right to declare war. You're also going to have the Commerce Clause built into that, which is a significant power, along with the Elastic Clause. And then in Article 2, you're going to be spelling out the powers and the requisites to become the president. Article 3 is probably the forgotten one in the sense that there's more of an afterthought. There's not a lot really in there in Article 3, but that, of course, is going to deal with the judicial branch. And then Article 4 is going to be dealing with state obligations to one another, such as the full faith and credit clause, extradition clause, basically the obligations that states share with one another. Article 5 is going to be talking about how to amend the Constitution should people in the future want to add additional amendments. Certainly they have done that. They've added an additional 17 amendments to the Bill of Rights. And then Article 6 is going to deal with the supremacy clause with respect that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, so it takes precedence over state laws and any other type of law that comes. It is the supreme document of the land. And then Article 7 is going to be dealing with ratification of the U.S. Constitution before it was ratified and what was required in that sense. And then after Article 7, you're going to be dealing with the first 10 amendments, which of course is known as the Bill of Rights, which the Anti-Federalists are going to say these absolutely need to be included in our Constitution to ensure that the federal government does not abuse its powers. And then the remaining part of this is the additional 17 amendments that have been added to the U.S. Constitution. And certainly there have been 17 very important amendments included there. Final document, the letter from Birmingham Jail, and this is such a powerful document, and I will very much recommend that you read this, but Dr. King is actually in prison, arrested for demonstrating without a permit, and he's going to spend 11 days in solitary confinement after this very peaceful march in Birmingham, Alabama. And he's going to be laying out the framework for nonviolent resistance, and it's going to be direct action. The idea that instead of negotiation, which is going nowhere, and white moderates are not really having good faith in the negotiations, that now here's a call for sit-ins, for boycotts, for marches, and that people have an obligation to break unjust laws. And one of the more famous quotes that comes out of this document is, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And he's also going to be writing this directly to the white clergymen who are arguing that racial segregation should be argued in the courts, not the streets. And they're also going to argue that just wait it out, it will happen. Well, King is going to say, listen, it took the slaves 345 years to get their freedom, and an additional, close to 100 years now on top of 345 years of being enslaved. Blacks still do not have civil rights. So he's going to be laying out why this is the time to act, and that essentially the clergymen need to get their act together, stop sitting on the sidelines, and to be with the civil rights protesters. So again, a very powerful document, and there are your documents that you need to know for the AP Gov exam.